My name is David Gumpfner, and I am Vice President of Government Affairs at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Welcome to the Michigan Freedom Embassy and today's Issues and Ideas event. It's time to work. State licensing reforms Michigan should consider. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy is a nonprofit research and educational institute that advances the principles of free markets and limited government. Through our research and education programs, we challenge government outreach and advocate for free market approaches to public policy that free people to realize their potential and their dreams. Since 1987, we have been a champion for freedom for the residents of Michigan and beyond. From hot dog stands and food trucks, to parents seeking educational choices for their children, to workers exercising union rights, to overtaxed business owners and entrepreneurs fighting for a level playing field. With them and others, we work to advance a more free and prosperous Michigan. To introduce our program and speakers today, I'd like to bring up our moderator, Alana Wilson, who serves as a program officer and state strategist for economic affairs at Stand Together Trust.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to see this many people excited about licensing. I've been studying licensing and been in the licensing world for a little over 7 years. And I always get particularly excited when we have a panel specifically focused on licensing, especially in a state like Michigan where it's so impactful. Again, my name is Alana Wilson. I'll be moderating the panel, taking your questions, and really just getting the best information out of these panelists as possible. Speaking of the panelists, I'd like to introduce them. I guess I'll go with Heather Curry first from Goldwater Institute. And then right next to her is Shelly Edgerton, where she is with PharmaCann right now, but she is formerly the director of the Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs in Michigan. And then we have Jarrett Skorup, who's from here, from Mackinac Center. So I will turn it over to Jarrett to start and get things started for us.
All right, thank you. So like Alana said, I'm Jarrett Skorup. I'm with the Mackinac Center. She said we got a lot of people here for the event. I don't know that anyone was excited about licensing, but they're here to hear about it. So I told my mom was a teacher. My dad taught, and he also did construction. So he's dealt kind of with some of the licensing. But I remember telling him I was doing a report on licensing, and I couldn't explain it to them what that meant. So, but that was 10 years ago. So hopefully I've improved. We'll try to explain it. We do think this is an important topic here in Michigan, but first let's say what we mean by this. Number one, what is licensing? So the shortest way is this is government permission to work. So most jobs in the economy, you can go out and you work a job. You want to open a restaurant, you might have some regulations, but you don't actually need a certification, a degree, or a license to do the job. But licensing is a requirement of that. Typically, this is we mandate a certain degree to do a job, or you have to go to the state and get a license to do something. And then as part of that, you have mandated fees, you have education, training hours, exams, something that you have to do. And the change in this has happened over the decades. So if you go back, 50 years, I think 50 years, and now it's like, well, okay, that was 1975. So I guess I got to go further than that. So if you go to 1960 in Michigan, there was 7 or 8 occupations that were licensed. And they were what you'd think. They were doctors. They were in the health professions, lawyers, barbers. Barbers were one of the earliest professions licensed. We'll get into a little bit of why that might be. But that began rapidly expanding, especially in 1980. 1980 in Michigan, we began adding all these other licenses, construction industry, education. Education was a little bit earlier than that, childcare, things like that. And then the last 20 years, we began adding it to all these other kind of new areas. And so there's been this big growth in a variety of different ways. There is a lot of bipartisan work on this. It's one of those unique things where this is all happening, almost all of it at the state level. There's a couple of things that are federally licensed or regulated, things that cross state lines, but for the most part, this is state level reforms. Makes it a really interesting research area because you can see, well, this state licenses barbers with this many hours. This state requires massage therapists to be licensed. This one doesn't. So we can look at what happens with health and safety effects, what happens with jobs, what happens with employment, what happens with income. And so our last 3 presidential administrations have all looked at this. The Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, mostly the labor departments, but also the Federal Trade Commission. And they're all essentially, they're in some pretty broad agreement. And, you know, these are restrictions that are in place. There is some evidence out there that for some licenses, it does serve a protection for the public. But most of the research is on the other end, which is it is a restriction, and we don't have great evidence that it's actually doing the true purpose of protecting public health and safety. And these things are also, they're regulated in wildly different ways. So you can cross one state border and see something totally different than you do in another state. And if that happens, I think we should want that to exist only if there's a real reason for it. But the general research says this costs about 1.7 million jobs. If you impose these restrictions, fewer people are going to work in them. That's kind of economics 101. That might be worth the cost. If it protects the health and safety, maybe it's worth the cost, but it does cost jobs. It raises prices for consumers because the number one thing that happens when you license something is you immediately get fewer people working into it, less competition, raises prices for consumers, 10 to 30%, kind of the assumption. And then it increases college debt. So if you think about, I've been kind of interested in this, we talk about student loans and this debt crisis going on. I think a lot of people's minds go right to like a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, something like that. A lot of that college debt is in these trade schools. In the state of Michigan, we require our massage therapists to go to school. We require our cosmetologists, our barbers. They're going to a school, and many of them, aren't able to. They'll get out, they'll go through, maybe they don't finish, and they have debt from those programs. And then there is not a ton of evidence on improved health and safety. I'll try to prove that last point for you. I have a couple of reports that are over there if you're interested in this. A lot of this data is from my newest one, which came out last year. This documents every occupational license in the state of Michigan. You can find that online. It's a database. You can find every job, who licenses it, the specifics of what you actually need, what kind of training, what kind of tests, things like that, and then the total cost that the state will charge you to do it. So you can check that out if you're a nerd like me. We do this for about 180 licenses in Michigan, and we spend $540 million attempting to regulate this. So then the question is, well, all right, Mr. Skorup, you said that these laws don't make any sense. And, the Biden and Trump administration, maybe they'll do that in the debate later this year. They'll start talking about occupational licensing. If they're in agreement and you're so smart, then why do we have all these licenses? Well, we've got lawmakers here. Some of them might be able to tell you. They're put in place by lawmakers, but it's an interesting issue because if any of the lawmakers here put up a bill tomorrow and say, you know what I want to do? I want to hike the business tax here in Michigan. Right or wrong, they're going to hear from some groups saying, yep, we should hike the business tax. Here's what we can use the money from. And they're going to hear from the business group saying, nope, you shouldn't hike the business tax. Here's what it's going to cost you. Licensing works, so the business community will oppose that. The associations for licensing support the licenses. So I have talked to lawmakers that say, well, the industry came in and said they want the license. And why would I not do it? Doesn't make any sense. Seems to make sense. If they want it, they know their industry, they should do it. The problem is the industry is benefiting. The associations, often they will come in and say, we do need this restriction. We do need this new license. Here's a variety of reasons we need it. And sometimes they'll even follow up and say, and by the way, you should grandfather our current members into that. So we've seen this a lot in Michigan. So property managers have to have a real estate license. This is the only state. The only state in the nation is Michigan that requires if you manage property, you have the real estate license. Well, who supports that law? I love my realtor friends, but the realtors support that law because you're forcing people to go be a realtor and go through these restrictions. Musical therapists, they supported a new licensing requirement to mandate that they have a college degree, clinical training hours. 3 times in the last 3 sessions, lawmakers have proposed hunting and fishing licenses. The bill sponsor said, hey, this is brought to us by the industry. Fire sprinklers. We've had this big debate over regulations of mandating fire sprinklers. No surprise, the people who install fire sprinklers are the ones that support that type of regulation. Food delivery drivers. There was a proposal to license the people that are delivering food. Rose up a lot during COVID. People were getting that to happen. It was a restaurant owner who was a state rep that introduced that bill. And then for solar panel installers, which was a really interesting issue, the Mackinac Center was testifying along with the green energy groups. Some lawmakers, I'm sure that would excite you, because they wanted and said that's too many restrictions on solar panels. There was a proposed license that to even transport solar panels, you should have to have an electrician's license. We said that's too much regulation. That doesn't make sense. The green energy groups and the groups that produce those solar panels said that's going to raise the cost of installing solar panels. So we don't like it. We testified together. On the other side was the electricians who said, yeah, of course, free business for us. So the point on that being is it's a tricky thing when the industry is the one coming in asking to do that. Here's a couple of people we've helped over the years. Michigan, like all states, has a cosmetology license. We do not have a hair braiding license here in Michigan. However, hair braiders, many hair braiders, I learn things every day in my job. And one of the things I learned over my years at the Mackinac Center is a lot about hair braiding, which I never thought I was going to learn about. So I met Blanca Chabi. She's in Garden City. And what I learned was she had a competitor that's reached out to licensing and regulatory affairs. I'm sure it wasn't Shelly's fault, but to reach out to someone there because she had a shampoo bowl in order to braid hair. The hair had to be clean. She had a shampoo bowl. To do shampooing in the state of Michigan, you do need a cosmetology license. Shampooing, something we all do, most of us, every day, most days. All right. And so Austin Luce was another guy I met. He's a massage therapist. He went through the school. Indiana and Ohio, by the way, don't require a license for massage therapists. I haven't heard too many horror stories down there, but Michigan does. Austin has a twin brother named Logan. They both went through the school. They both took out debt in Saginaw. They both got through that program. State of Michigan requires their massage therapist to then take a test. Austin was able to pass the test. Logan has learning disability, was not able to pass the test. So now he has $15,000 in debt. He learned how he did a massage therapist. All he wants to do is go work for another massage therapist. He couldn't pass the test, which had a lot of things about how to keep up with your license and financial data. And it had marketing sections and things like that, stuff that he really didn't need. And then I'll skip Mike Brennan. So Mike and who I got to meet, he was a construction worker. He had criminal background. So he had committed some crimes, drug-related crimes in his background. He was unable to initially to come out and get a license to work in the construction industry because Michigan's licensing laws, the vast majority have what we call good moral character provisions that were preventing him. A lot of our licenses are very arbitrary. I mentioned my dad does construction. I worked for him for a long time. We were flipping a house that was my entire spring break 2 weeks ago. So I'm always interested in this. So the red are the requirements, the things that are required to be licensed here in Michigan. The green are the things we do not require the license for. We require a license for carpentry, not drywall, concrete, not asphalt, excavation, but not sewer and septic, insulation, but not plaster, on and on. Putting up a fence, you don't need a license for. Putting up siding, you do. So for a lot of these, they're pretty similar types of trades. There's not really a big major difference. You would think in the knowledge and skills that you need. Some got licensed and some didn't. Librarians who work in Michigan public schools, you need a bachelor's degree and a teaching certificate to be a librarian for any of our public school system, which has been a big push in the recent years to have more of. If you're a librarian in a town, you don't need that. In fact, if you're in a small enough town, all you need is a GED degree. So somewhat arbitrarily regulated. Selling produce like apples, tomatoes, corn, lettuce, cabbage, no state license. But if you sell honey, maple syrup, apple cider, eggs, only regulated if you go over a certain level. But if you sell meat, fish, mushrooms, garlic, herbs, bagels, donuts, cookies, got to get the state license. And then The nursery grower's license is incredibly arbitrary. My wife was at a nursery where they said, we're not renewing this license next year, so these items are free. And I thought there were these, what looked to me, the exact same types of items that they didn't need a license for, but these other ones that they did. And there's kind of these esoteric reasons why. And then there's things where maybe we're going to have a license for these different things, but the requirements are wildly out of whack. So athletic trainers, they got to get a college degree. It's 1,460 hours of training. EMTs, it's 200 hours in order to do that job. The FAA requires 40 hours of flight time to get a license to fly people. Shampooing hair in Michigan is 400 training hours. That's kind of a sub-license of cosmetology. Commercial airline pilots, I know two of our panelists flew in today. So that's a requirement of 1,500 hours of flight time for the person that was flying your airplane. I'm sorry to say that's fewer than we require for barbers here in the state of Michigan. Barbers have to do 1,800 hours. And then Michigan police officers, almost 600 hours of curriculum and training. That's 1/3 that we mandate for the barbers. Then a lot of jobs that are out there. So if you open a restaurant, no license. If you're a chef at a restaurant, none. Asphalt paving, none. Small community librarian, none. Auto mechanic, 6 hours. It's a private certification that they all, and then it goes up from there. So just really, to me, kind of out of whack with what I think most people would think of if we're really wanting to stay focused on public health and safety. There are local licenses in Michigan. We have reformed this, interestingly. Bay City licensed fortune tellers, which they did not see coming, I'm afraid. Louder for the video people. Okay. Lansing, we license auctioneers. Interesting. Snow plowers in Grand Rapids and window washers in Detroit. We did. And then I talked about those. We had those good moral character provisions. So we were, and the issue with those is, from my perspective, is okay. If somebody comes out of prison, we want to make sure that people know about it. Maybe their employer knows about it. Maybe they should have to have something to be honest about what their background is, but we shouldn't restrict somebody. And a lot of the lawmakers in here know we fund these prison training programs. We literally fund these programs where people can learn to do these trades programs in prison, and then they come out, and we previously denied them the license to work in that industry. All right, so I've got this down to 5 things I think Michigan should do. The good news is we've done a couple of them. So number 1 is we should just review every license, and we should look at it on health and safety, not competition. We shouldn't look at it on because the industry necessarily wants it. We should do a real analysis on judging it based on health and safety. I did a report with Dr. Tom Hemphill, University of Michigan Flint. We did this. So we said, here's how we would, if you actually wanted to, and we applied this to a couple of jobs and said, if you actually wanted to say, well, did Michigan's painter license make sense? Here's what kind of process we would run it to. Or should barbers have 1,800 hours, or should we cut it down to 800 hours like some other places? So we talk about how to do that type of analysis, and then we should get rid of the ones that are not effective or regulate them differently. Like I said, my dad was a deck builder. It wouldn't really be relevant for him to have to sit through the 60-hour training video and program that Michigan requires. What's relevant in deck building is the inspections. They inspect different parts of the deck. So let's focus on that rather than the mandatory hours. We have done this one. We allow people with a criminal record to work, provided their crime was not directly related to the occupation. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply to all occupations. In Michigan, that applies to many of them. It doesn't apply to a lot of the public employees, health occupations in particular. And so for me, if somebody has a drug offense when they were 19 years old, I don't think they should be prevented from being a nurse for the rest of their life. The hospital can make that decision. The medical provider can make that decision. The state should not stand in the way of allowing that person to go in and work. Prevent local governments from licensing. If you're good enough to be a plumber in Oakland County, you should be good enough to be one in Wayne County. That is one that lawmakers also did get rid of. And then we should do universal recognition. So we have been moving in this way, a lot of ways. We have all these shortages across a variety of fields. Lawmakers have been taking this up. We should do one universal law, which is if you're a teacher in Indiana and a school district wants to hire you in Michigan, great, let them do it. We don't need to go through an extra process every time they move or every time a military spouse or something moves. but we should apply that to all licenses. If you're a barber in another state, if you're a painter in another state, massage therapist, I think Michigan should open it up, let them come in and work right away. So that's my presentation. Looking forward to the questions.
Great. Well, I hope you guys can hear me. So I'll just jump on there. Jared asked me to come and talk a little bit to you about sort of the national dynamic on licensing reform. And I will say, you guys are not the only ones that license ridiculous things. There are other states that are doing it worse. So you can take some small comfort in that. For example, Louisiana is the only state that licenses florists. There are 9 states that license tree trimmers. So a lot of disparity among the states. And that's actually why, at the end of his presentation, he just mentioned universal recognition. So this is a reform that we first enacted in Arizona in 2019. It allows an out-of-state licensee to come into the state and apply their out-of-state qualifications toward a license to work in their new state. So we did that in 2019. Goldwater Institute and IJ designed that reform. We've been working on it for a number of years. We've now had 20 other states pursue a similar reform. In Arizona, since we put it into place in late 2019, we've had over 9,000 workers licensed. And this, because we applied it, we weren't very broad. Some states have kind of been tinkering around with certain occupations or certain fields. We went extremely broad, applied it to all of our occupations under Title 32, which is the section of our code that oversees the bulk of occupations in the state. So we've got physicians, architects, sorry, there's my name tag, cosmetologists, basically anybody that you can think of. So we've had 9,000 folks safely licensed, which has just been incredible. But the idea really being that once you cross state lines or you move from one community to the next, you don't suddenly forget your skills or forget your training. And so long as you've really been working at the same scope of practice, a licensing board can look at what you've been doing in your other state. Are you in good standing? Do you have any disqualifying criminal, background, that sort of thing? You should be able to come into the state and be licensed quickly and get to work. So we've seen a huge amount of success with that reform in Arizona, and then certainly other states as well. But really, for us, we have seen, and I think, Jarrett mentioned a number of the stories where you have perfectly capable people who are kept out of the workforce because of vested interests or, certain industries want to keep the number of folks who are working down. And so, of course, that has impacts. And he mentioned some of the research has impacts on, consumer availability of quality providers and wages, has all sorts of effects across the board. But universal recognition for us has really been, since we got it done in Arizona, it has taken off like gangbusters. I think there's really no other real way to explain it. We've had certainly a number of very red states have done it. Now, when you're working in a state where everyone is blue, it can be a little bit more challenging. But I think, we've had a great amount of success. We've had several Democrat governors sign recognition reforms, particularly in Pennsylvania and Colorado. But really, I think, talking about it, people understand how regressive it is to ask folks who've already jumped through a significant amount of hoops, whether it's training or testing or just the cost, time away from their families to get their licenses, and they move to a new state and they don't know if they're going to be able to continue to work in their own job or in their job. And so the aggressive nature, I think, of licensing is something that is a problem for every state, certainly Michigan, certainly other places. So recognition, like I said, it's had a huge amount of momentum across the country. We're continuing to see that. We had a reform just this week in Louisiana that's been advancing. Just got it done in Nebraska after a handful of years. But so recognition, of course, being an important one, and we've got, you've got information on your site. We've got a huge amount of information on the Goldwater website. But then also, Jarrett mentioned, what is the function of regulation in this space? It's to ensure a certain level of public health and safety. And so we have another reform called the Right to Earn a Living Act, which essentially sets a standard for occupational licensing, sets the public health and safety standard. And so if a regulation does not meet that set standard, an applicant or a person can then challenge that regulation directly and say, why is this here? What is it doing to advance public health and safety? And if a board can't articulate with specificity what particular public health or safety objective it advances, then it needs to come off the books, which to us is sort of common sense, right? But it's like we've had a lot of licensing regulations in particular that have been in the books. I think you mentioned back to the 60s. So we've had things that have been in place for years and years and years. And so people are hesitant to kind of go in and tinker with them. But if there's no reason, and you mentioned the example of the gentleman who wasn't able to get a license because he maybe didn't understand certain things that have to do with marketing around a particular occupation. Things are not necessarily, they're germane to running a business, but they're not necessarily germane to public health and safety. And so the Right to Earn a Living Act, which is something we've had in Arizona, and we've gotten it done in a handful of other states, provides an opportunity and I think a place for people to be able to push back on that. yeah, that's the long and short of it. We've, made significant strides, I think, in both red, blue, and purple, all states across the country. But I think people are really waking up to kind of the excesses of government and how it stands in the way of people being able to support their families and take care of themselves.
Well, I'm going to stand being one of the shortest panelists. That's okay. Shortest panelists, the stools are not that comfortable. So anyways, as Jared pointed out, occupational licensing isn't really the, shiny object everybody likes to talk about, but it is an impactful thing for the consumer, the customer, the licensee to be able to have that done. Now, I got a lot of familiar faces here, so they'll keep me honest in this historical perspective. But when I was director of licensing and regulatory affairs under Snyder, we really undertook a huge amount of reinvention. Governor Snyder was very strong proponent of looking at all the licensing act, and we produced a number of reports. There were 8 advisory reinvention councils, and did a thorough discussion review of licenses, much of which appears in Jarrett's work. And Jarrett is obviously an expert in this area. But I think, one thing that, besides the barriers to entry and you have industry coming forward, I think there's always an issue for the department. It's great for legislators to, be approached by individuals that want to be licensed or have a certificate or that, but sometimes there's not that other side of the table where the department gets to, come in and have an impact on what that looks like. When I first got to the department way back when, it took forever for a nurse to get a license. And what we had found at that point was that everything was siloed. If it showed up here as an entry at an applicant, it could be days before it made it to the next person and then to the next person, or nobody was even answering the phone for that person, because somebody was checking on a license. Obviously, then, of course, everything was not necessarily electronic as it is now. So that even made it worse. And so we undertook a lot of actions from the department side to really engage with the stakeholders to say, how better can we improve those processes? So it's not so much that we did eliminate some licenses. I think in one of our reviews, we had Ocularis. I think we ended up with like 2, but we had built a whole licensing program for them. So somebody had to be responsible for that license for 2 people in the state of Michigan. Yeah, it's like the fake eyes, kind of make the fake eyes. Yeah. So it was an interesting time, but I think it's important. And I know there's a number of legislators here. So, ask what the costs are to the department. Throwing on another license to someone in a licensing realm costs the department money. And you have to make sure that fees fit. If you're going to license, make sure the fee fits the regulation. We had at one time discussed, and I'm sure it probably didn't go much further, but a true up, because and probably anybody in the department today can tell you that not all licenses pay for themselves. Somebody is supporting that license. Whether it be the real estate agents, the realtors are paying for another smaller group, or CPAs are paying for another group. So some of your larger occupations are definitely paying for some of the smaller ones. And there's a real question of whether it's even a public health and safety issue. The other thing you need to understand is, what is the technology that will be behind it. I'm not sure if Derek's here from the department, if we're still using Excella as a licensing platform. Yeah, is that an ease of which you can do things? And I'm speaking more on the department side than necessarily the other side. Because it is important to understand that, somebody is going to be responsible. There is going to be an IT upgrade that's going to cost the department, and all those kind of things have to be factored into the cost of the license. And once you become realistic about those costs, especially on the department side, the licenses don't look appealing to the groups as much, because everybody says, oh, we can do a $10 certificate. Well, $10 certificate to you might cost the department $100,000. And so somebody's paying for that on the back end. So I just think that kind of stuff is very, very important. We produced a document. I was joking with these guys earlier, 110 pages, occupational licensees. We deregulated 18 occupations, eliminated a number of boards. But it's always a constant that I think it's important for the legislature, because this is a bipartisan issue. you're talking about customers, you're talking about clients, you're talking about potential licensees. These are avenues that impact them, personally and as an industry. So I always think it's important to look at what those needs are and really make sure that it's a health and safety. And obviously Jarrett's done a great job in how to analyze that and move forward. But other than that, I think we've probably covered just about everything and go from there. I don't think we need a history lesson. I do have to say one thing. I had an office back in the Senate back in the day in the corner over here on this floor. So I'm really happy to be back in the building.
I think we memorialized it back there somewhere. So Alana's going to do some moderate questions. You've got cards in front of you. So if you think of a question, we'll get to that after she does a few questions, and we'll take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, guys. I want to start with you, Jarrett. You said you would prove to us how, kind of making licenses more common sense would not affect health and safety. How can we make sure that that happens?
Yeah, there's just I hate the answer to be there's a ton of studies on something, because I think everyone's used to hearing there's a study on this, there's a study on that. It's one of those rare areas where there's such a consensus of people of researchers across the spectrum on how does this actually directly affect health and safety. And one of the hard things, particularly for lawmakers and people that work in the department, is somebody will come to you and they'll bring you a problem and they'll say, we'll solve the problem with a license. And feels like a solution. We have bad actors, we license them, they go away. And the hardest thing to accept on that is there are always bad actors. And the question is, does a license actually prevent those people? Or does it do things where you license 180 occupations and Shelley and Laura are going around trying to regulate a bunch of these smaller industries rather than staying very focused on the ones that matter. I try to show that with the arbitrary regulations. The other way I asked it is this way. What's the most important thing? Probably the state licenses, the most direct health and safety that anyone can think of. Anyone want to shout it out? Yeah. Medical industry. Yeah. Usually that's what you hear. Doctors. All right. So I love Laura. They run great databases. I can go look up the licensing report of my medical doctor, and I have, and I can see have they had any problems? Have they been reported? Did they get their license pulled at some point? Did something happen? Has anyone done that for their own doctor? Okay, one person in here. So even on the most important thing regulated, people don't go and do that. I don't think they really do that. You trust that the license means something that I think a lot of times it just doesn't. And I don't think people are pulling those reports every time they hire somebody to come fix a faucet or do electrical work or whatever. What you care about is the same thing you probably care about for doctors. Reputation. I heard about this from my sister who really likes the person, and just that the fact that they're able to stay in business and have people, reviews, things like that. So I think that's a better way to regulate the system than this strict occupational code.
Yeah, so just to build on that too is, also industry is very adamant always about having continuing education, the CE credits. And those can be used more as a tool for educating and creating better licensees at the end of the game, maybe when they've been sanctioned. I know when at first when we had, when I was in Laura early on, the department did a lot of CE monitoring, which was a huge workload. And again, I'm talking back in the day when everything wasn't so electronic. It became a real burden for us. So we shifted to, getting away from doing testing ourselves, and shifted, having the monitoring. I think the CPAs, or you guys can correct me, CPAs and realtors do their own CE monitoring now. So building on those kind of things is important. And I think to Jarrett's point about inspections is really where you want to have it. I mean, that's where the sanctions are. That's where you find out somebody's a bad actor, and if people are doing things illegally, without a certificate or a license, they're going to continue to do it anyways. It's going to be word of mouth and how you get at those people. I mean, a lot of people probably go build their own deck or don't pull a permit to install a new door or a new window, never give a thought about it. But yet we have this huge, licensing scheme for all these little parts of a building project for somebody to be able to do something. And somebody might just go over to Menards and, grab a door and install it themselves and didn't realize they should have pulled a permit at the local level, but two, also maybe should have had a licensed contractor put it in.
Anarchists.
And before we get into any audience questions, just one more quick question for Heather. So you told us more about universal licensing and that kind of being the crown jewel of what makes the most sense, right? So haircuts don't change from Michigan to Pennsylvania to Ohio. I mean, maybe they do, but the way in which you cut hair should not change. So I want to know, like, what is the first step when you enter a state and start to try to have these universal licensing conversations? What does that look like? What are the first steps?
Just when we're talking with legislators or groups or kind
I
of,
think a little bit of both, but let's focus legislators first, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where the action
well,
happens.
I think certainly getting a sense for, and we always work very closely with our allies on the ground. So, Mackinac certainly here and then in other organizations, and, getting a sense for where pain points are, who's going to come out and, you've mentioned vested interests and who has loudest voice and where are they going to get the most pushback. And then kind of anticipating what those questions are going to be, what their concerns are. A lot of the times, the questions are very consistent from organization or from industry to industry. They want to know how the process works. They want to know, how does this again impact public health and safety? They want to know if it's going to, take longer to process applications or if it's going to be faster to process applications. Kind of how it affects their day to day. So before we go in and we work in a state, certainly we connect again with our partners on the ground. But we've been working on this now in so many places that we can sort of anticipate what the questions from particular industries will be. And we have, I think very good evidence now, particularly because we've had this now in Arizona for 5 years and it's been working great. We sort of have responses to a lot of the questions that do come up. And I think, no one wants to kind of create a situation where, Jared mentioned bad actors, where bad actors slip through the cracks. Now, under recognition, you have to have held your license for at least a year. That license has to be in good standing. The other state has to sign off on, the good standing nature of the license. And so, we're able to kind of weed out a lot of folks, I think, just based on that one very sort of common sense standard. But, being able to kind of anticipate the questions that we're going to get in advance from lawmakers and then certainly groups. But like I said, now we've had this in place for 5 years. It's in Arizona. It's been in place in a handful of others now for 4 years. And then, like I said, we've had over 20 states do either a very broad recognition or an industry specific recognition. And so we're really, I think, able to kind of get out ahead of a lot of the concerns and a lot of the questions and show that, and in Arizona, we haven't had any of the licenses, as far as I know. We did a survey on it last year. None of the licenses that have been issued under universal recognition have come up under any complaint, which is incredible considering that's 9,000 people and it's across a very broad swath of licenses. What I will say too is, we get a lot of questions from boards, as you expect. They're always concerned about whether or not they are still able to deny licenses. So if someone doesn't meet the standard, how are they able to, do they lose all their ability to regulate, really? And they, of course, don't. They're still empowered to determine the scope of practice of a license. If a scope of practice from, Texas doesn't match Michigan, then the board can say, hey, this isn't quite the right fit. And so in Arizona, we've seen, because we survey the boards every 3 to 6 months, and, we see licenses being denied. And a lot of the time it's because, scope doesn't align or someone hasn't lived in Arizona for the amount of time or what have you. So the boards are still able to make those decisions. And so I think, just kind of being able to get out ahead of the questions. And that's been really useful for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions? If you have questions like from the little cards or.
Yeah, go ahead and hand the cards down as you write those things, and Alana can pick them up. I was just gonna, add on to that point a little bit. Yeah, and a lot of, like I mentioned with the universal recognition, is that we, especially now in the teaching or nurses or something, they're working for an employer. It's not like a teacher is hanging up their own shingle and people are like, well, did they get their license? Where'd they get their license? They're getting hired by a school. If a school says, they go through the interview process and they say, okay, I think they can do the job, and they bring them in and hire them from school, or the hospital says, yep, they've been a nurse, they have experience, and they get hired, then, there's no reason the department is going to know any better about whether they can do that job than the actual direct person that's in charge of employing them.
And I'll just add a little bit. The universal licensing is a great idea, and we've kind of evolved. I mean, it used to be reciprocity, then there were a lot of compacts, and now it's the universal licensing, which is the next step, which makes a lot of sense, especially for a number of the licenses. And I look at Michigan and the teacher shortages, and you have the, Way to Grow program, and you have people coming from all kinds of disciplines, and they're eventually going to have a certificate to, teach at the school at some sort. But we also have to think about, the ability to merge licenses. I mean, is there really a need to have a lot of distinguishing things between cosmetology and barber? I know back when I was in the department, that was a big issue. I mean, everybody came out against it. We tried to merge at least the boards, or at least, because it didn't make sense. I mean, you're dealing with hair, you're dealing with sharp instruments. But, it was almost insane the way the industries came out opposed to merging the two to basically be a hair industry. But those are kind of things that you can also look at that can help, speed along licensing, but also speed along the ability of people to enter the marketplace if you're actually going to have a license. But it is evolution. I mean, the universal licensing I don't know that it's taken hold in Michigan yet, but, that is going to be the next avenue.
And I will say too, recognition in particular doesn't supplant the other things that Shelley mentioned, whether it's compacts. It's just an additional pathway. And the reason for this and the need for the pathway is that, as we kind of discussed earlier, not all states regulate everything the same. Some states don't license a lot of regulations at all. And then some, we talked about cosmetology. Some states, I think Nebraska used to be 2,100 hours, and then you have Arizona, which is significantly shorter. And so big disparities. And so the idea behind it is to create a pathway for skilled workers and not punish them for state to state differences in regulatory approaches. And so if someone wants to use a compact, they can use a compact. So for example, Arizona is part of the nurse licensure compact. So a lot of nurses go through that. They don't use recognition because the pathway works for them to go that way. But so other things where you have now with a compact that suggests a certain number of states that are participating. So should the folks who are coming from non-compact states be punished and not be able to work in a new state because their state hasn't taken action on the compact? Of course not. That's ridiculous. And so recognition provides an efficient pathway for those workers to be able to come to bring their skills into a state.
Some folks are finishing up. I'm really glad you guys dove into that, because that was going to be my next question while I was collecting cards, was like, what is the difference between universal licensing, universal recognition, compact agreements? We hear a lot of those, like, especially with teachers and everything. We're like, okay, I thought that, there was some sort of something that was reciprocity with teachers, when in reality it's a compact agreement. It's not the same.
Right. And we talk about the differences between reciprocity and recognition, right? Reciprocity suggests you're doing something in exchange for something else. Recognition is you're doing this because it's good for your state, right? You want workers to come into the state. You don't need to ask permission from your neighbor to make it easier for people to come into Michigan and work.
Yeah.
And so we use that language intentionally.
The practical way it works is a compact there's states that say we're somewhat similarly regulated, and so you can move across state lines. And then the recognition, the issue you get there is Michigan does require a license for deck builders. Indiana doesn't. But if somebody has worked in and has experience as a deck builder there and doesn't have any issues that you can find, they can move in and be recognized with that license.
So just staying on the topic, or going, I guess, back to the topic sort of education and educators, we haven't really spoken too much on the topic of educator licensure. With a lot of charter schools and different school choice options popping up, that's a worry. There may be some charter schools that are a bit more careless in their hiring, or it seem that way. There may be a new threat that may be presented. How can we make sure that doesn't happen? Or is there case studies in other states? Is there something else we can look at to just make sure we can kind of ease this new normal that may be the education system in the country?
It's a great question. I will tell people sometimes, like, I'll have friends that are teachers that say, no, you got to understand, here's the teacher certification is so important. They do this and this and this. And I just note to people, there are thousands of teachers that are uncertified that are working in the state of Michigan right now. They're at private schools. As in, the state does not, now most private school teachers do actually have a teacher certification, but they're not mandated to. The school kind of determines that. And what you'll often see there is what you do see in other states, where someone has a bachelor's in biology and they decide, actually, I think I want to teach. And if you have to go do the certification, you're going to have to go back and do another year of schooling or try to piece that together. Whereas a school might say, all right, well, let's bring them in as a substitute teacher or a long-term sub for 3 or 4 months, which like a private school will have the flexibility to do, and then says, oh, wow, this man or this woman's a really great teacher. Okay, good. They're good. They don't need to go get the actual teacher certification. There's a lot of schools that are exploring that now. The lawmakers have, and the department has freed this up for education a bit. There are new, Detroit Public Schools is doing its own accrediting of schools. They're trying to get like people who've worked as school aides for 20 years that they recognize that could be really great teachers and say, I don't want them to have to go back and do 4 years of a bachelor's degree and a certification in order to teach. Well, let's set up a process that makes it a little bit easier. And so there are ways to explore that. And the problem of licensing is it takes everybody and puts them in this really strict box of what they need to do. It's set up to be, you graduate high school, you do 4 years of school, maybe you do a 1 year, maybe you go do a master's. And I just don't think that that is the best way to recognize teachers. You have a lot of people that came out, they were stay-at-home moms or dads for a while. They don't want to, if you force them to go back and do 4 years of school, they're just never going to even take that chance. And so I think having the flexibility where the employer can work out what accreditation actually makes sense, but the only way to do that is you got to free up the actual teaching licensing laws.
I have one that you may or may not know the answer to, but how many hours does an HVAC tech need? Do we know?
Go to the next question and I'll grab it in the back of what was it?
HVAC.
Oh, HVAC.
tech. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be under the,
HVAC, sorry. Pennsylvania. we
so
just
I
say
can tell you
HVAC.
that it's going to be a lot. The electricians are the most. That's the most mandatory hours in the state. And they are, but same thing with HVAC, heating and air conditioning. I got to find it, but it's going to be a lot. But the reason a lot of those are a lot is you can do the hours as an apprentice. So you are active. You can go in with no experience and start as an apprentice. Now, before you get the actual license, and those that know, there's different levels of license for that. You have to do a certain amount of hours, but at least you're earning money and you're learning on the job while you're going through that process. But like, yeah, electricians are like 8,000. I bet HVAC is probably like 1,000, something like that. A lot of them are around that 1,000 or 1,200.
So this one is for all three of you. So if you graduated from a nationally accredited program and a state accredited program, then why the licensing? What does it really mean if you graduated from a state accredited program or college?
Usually, if I'm getting at what they're on, is that if you say I want to go be an architect and I go to the school, they're going to make sure you're hitting what the license requires, which is specific classes and hours, and like for students doing a certain amount of student teaching and things like that. So, I mean, most of the time you're going to get that through the program. One thing you do for a lot of these new areas that are licensed is there are these where and I've heard from a lot of people where they think they hit those requirements and they didn't. And because the school didn't have it correctly. On the recognition issue, we did an event on this last year where I met a woman named Ann Davis. She spoke in that panel. I met her a couple of months before. She was working as a therapist, and she'd been doing this for decades in Colorado, but she's from Michigan originally. So she moved back to Michigan, and she's trying to work through Laura, and they did try to want to help her. And so she contacted me because she said, they're not recognizing my license, even though she'd been doing the same amount of work, the same work she wanted to do here. And it was down to like, there was one specific class that the Michigan licensing code required you to take in college, and she couldn't get the transcript of that class. And so she finally was able to work out a deal with them, which is basically she signed an affidavit saying, yes, I did take that class. But that's the type of thing that happens where there can be down to a very specific type of thing as part of that process. Even though she already had moved, she already had an employer, she was already ready to get working with people in an area that we have a very high need, she still had to navigate that system.
All right, and then our last question that we have is, cosmetologists, if they're not able to practice without a license in their home, in a nursing home, and homeless shelters, as we've seen, a viral story go around, especially if you can ensure the cleanliness, which I just have to add this little ad lib on here because I've worked in licensing for a while too, that it always questions restaurants versus, cosmetologists, but anyway, Department of Health is good for restaurants. But anyway, so especially if you can ensure cleanliness and or teach for free, do you see a result just being people doing it under the table more? Like, would you potentially see that happening? Is that people just kind of started doing things under the table and then there was no tax revenue for the state?
It is happening right now. I got my hair cut 2 weeks ago, and the person mentioned, oh, at my at-home studio, I do this. And I know from doing this, that's not legal. Like you can't have that. Now, Michigan actually did make a little more flexibility with the barbers and cosmetologists where you can do these mobile salons now. But previously it was you were in this establishment and that's what you had to do and be subject to it. And the cosmetology and barber one is interesting because if you really press on like, why do you have what barbers had 2,000 hours at one point and the negotiation got them to 1,800 hours, and cosmetologists are a little bit better. Maybe we care about our men's hair a little bit more because the barbers are 1,800, the women are 1,600. I don't know. If you're really pressed, they're basically like, well, somebody has to make sure that they are cleaning things properly. It's like, I feel like that's 20 hours. I don't know. Like, this is a lot of hours here, and just subject them to inspection. But it is already happening. We saw this during COVID where the governor actually, one of her executive orders was to loosen those licensing restrictions because it wasn't legal. If not, the actual cosmetology and barber license in Michigan is you cannot cut someone's hair that is not a direct family member unless you have the license. You can't braid a friend's hair. You can't go through and trim your kid's hair or your nephew's hair on your back deck. That is illegal according to the cosmetology and barber code in the state of Michigan. Does anyone follow that? Not many.
And I think you pointed out, COVID, post-COVID, everybody's, working hybrid or working from home or that, and people are just doing business in their homes without proper licensing, especially, cosmetologists or barbers. So they are doing it. And you are right. There was a big battle between cosmetologists and barbers. We couldn't figure that one out, but anyways, but I think it's important to just go back and recognize, what people are doing in today's world. I mean, I was in the department a long time ago, and we've vastly improved, through technology and licensing and new platforms and things like that. But it's always great to go back and start looking at these licenses again, especially post-COVID. I mean, everything has changed. I mean, nobody's going into somebody's house to inspect it. They're still doing inspections at a salon, hopefully, and maybe somebody's there one day a week now because they're working out of their home the rest of the time because that was easier during COVID. So, I mean, those kind of adjustments, it's just a continuing evolution for the department and the legislature to constantly look at these things and just keep updating. I know Jared's pointed out, occupational licensing and reviews and reinventions have been going on for decades. Well, it needs to continue because it needs to keep up with today's world and what's really the practices of the occupations.
That's a really good point. I just wanted to point out too, that made me think that keeping up with today's world and the occupations. I know one of the reasons why when we were digging into licensing and why it was licensed in the first place, well, because there were no review sites available for things like cosmetology, not necessarily for doctors, and never advocating that your doctor shouldn't be properly trained. However, I think continuously looking back, like they've all pointed out that is the key. Like, let's take a look at our laws. I know that when I worked for the Knee Regulatory Research Center, WVU was the Knee Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation. And one of the things that we really dove into was, barbers have heavy restrictions because it was put into place when they were allowed to do bloodletting and do things like that. So that's what we're still holding on to, those type of requirements and those type of hourly restrictions for that reason. When cosmetologists may use more dangerous chemicals than barbers. But again, we're holding on to this idea that we're still letting our barbers be our MDs. So there's really high numbers on that too. So just getting up with the times is a huge step that seems to be falling behind in licensing across all states, but especially in Michigan. Does anyone else have any other questions before I wrap everything up here? Just want to give the audience just another thing. All right, great. So final thoughts. I'll start over here with Heather.
Yeah, just, thanks so much for including Goldwater and myself on this panel. And, we're really excited to work particularly in this state on licensing reform. And, you guys are not the first ones on the roller coaster. So we've got a lot of great evidence that these reforms work, and we're happy to really help in any way that we can.
I'd just like to thank the Mackinac Center for allowing me to participate. I think occupational licensing, licensing in general, whether it be businesses or occupations, is always in need of constant review, especially in today's technology world, and the ability of people to move quicker, faster, and be mobile. People are going in and out. I mean, the governor talks about, getting more population into Michigan. Well, having those licenses and the ability to be able to do so would be a step in the right directions. But it's always a topic of good ideas. Sometimes it doesn't come easy because industries are entrenched with how they've been, licensed, and they like the world they live in without allowing others to do it. But I think it's an area that always needs constant review. And if anything, I always think you should engage the department, whatever the license is going to be, to get their input and to have that impact on it. Because at some point, somebody on the back end is going to be paying for it if the licensees don't pay for it.
Government has a role in protecting the public. I think most people, Alana just brought up the restaurant example. We don't require a license for the actual cook or the waiter or the waitress or the owner. There's a general business license and they're subject to inspections. And that's a better route. Focus on what you actually care about when you're thinking about the regulation, and recognize that every time you do a new rule or pass a new law, you are immediately blocking people out. You're blocking consumers from more choices, and you're blocking people out of that industry. And the most important thing to me is that people can come in, learn a job, and become entrepreneurs and work their way up.
Thank you guys all so much for participating. To our panelists, thank you all for showing up. I think one of the biggest things we can walk away is let's keep occupational licensing in the conversation, just because it might not be super exciting to everyone like it is to us. The reform of it, let's be clear, doesn't mean that we can't make it impactful for your constituency. So just keep it, in the forefront of your mind. Highly encourage reviews. You have a lot of resources in front of you and out there. And yeah, I'm really excited to see what Michigan's going to do. So thank you guys all so much. Have a good rest of your day.